Hi, welcome to the Indie Wine Podcast. My name is Matt Wood, and this is episode 56. Today we start something a little different for harvest time. I have a series on the history of the California Wine Association, or CWA. They were the largest and most dominant wine company in the U.S. Pre Prohibition. Today's part one in the series. Wine is too cheap. I hope you come along on the journey with me. This episode and the ones that follow in the series connect lots of different people. Some that we have spoken about previously will make an appearance, and we will also hear some new names that deserve their own episodes, and they'll get them in time. The series connects almost everyone that was producing wine on any scale between the late 1880s until Prohibition. They weren't all involved with the CWA, but at times you were kind of with them or against them. I use gallons in this series. That's how quantities were measured then. Nowadays, you usually hear about case production, but if my math is correct, 1 million gallon wineries are roughly 416,000 cases. Another one note, you'll notice we hear a lot about red grapes and basically 5 white grapes. This isn't me cherry picking favorites. About 92% of the wine made and consumed at the time was red. We'll get into the reasons in another episode. In this first episode, we'll look at the background of the wine industry that led to the formation of the CWA and some of the key players as it comes together. Before we start, I'd like to let you know there's a Patreon you can donate to if you like what you hear and would like to help me keep telling wine stories ad-free. If you don't want to or can't, that's okay too. Maybe you could tell a friend who would also have interest in listening. Thanks. Here we go. At 5:12 a.m. on Wednesday, April 18th, 1906, the city of San Francisco and the surrounding Bay Area were shaken awake by a large jolt. A foreshock. 20 seconds later came the main quake, rupturing 300 miles of the San Andreas Fault where the North American and Pacific plates collide. Massive shaking lasted nearly a minute and was felt from Oregon to Nevada to Los Angeles, but mostly by the 400,000 who resided in the city. Over the last 50 years, San Francisco had reclaimed much of its land from the bay, and these areas felt it the worst. The land turned to liquid as it shook. Coastland of bay mud, sand, and dirt, repurposed from the leveling of San Francisco's many hills and then dumped over rocks, trash, and sunken gold rush ships were no match. Buildings on the more firm bedrock survived the quake better, but neither stood much chance with what was yet to come. The quake would measure 7.9 on the Richter scale, once the scale was developed, that is, but it's estimated 90% of the destruction was caused by fire. Gas and water pipes burst. These exploding gas mains would cause enormous fires that spread and raged more from the toppled candles and lanterns being used in the still dark city. Wooden homes and buildings burned in a flash. Brick buildings that were still standing turned into ovens. Within 30 minutes, fires were seen throughout the city, with smoke rising over the numerous hills. An aftershock around 9 a.m. toppled some buildings that the original quake had spared. The broken water mains took away the fire department's best shot at quenching the fires. Most didn't even realize there was no water at first. Swirling winds coming off the ocean and bay whipped the flames up even more. The fires burned around the clock for 4 days. This fire often taking a circuitous route to destroy buildings, say moving east and then winds coming over and around the hills, turning the flames again to destroy buildings that were missed the first time. The newly built city hall was gone in a flash, just its skeleton remained. Dynamite echoed through the city as the fire crews blew up buildings to try and slow the spread of fire. Unfortunately, the fire chief had died from injuries sustained in the earthquake, and most of his men were inexperienced with explosives. Often they're used as much harm as good. The fireboats did what they could, pumping water from the bay to save the blocks nearest the water. Adolphus Greeley, commanding officer of the Pacific, controlled over 4,000 troops on the scene. Greeley was no joke. He had led a polar expedition as a younger man. 18 of the 25 men perished after scheduled supply ships were unable to reach them for 2 straight winters. But he survived. Frederick Funston, commander of the Presidio II, was instrumental in helping to save the city. His troops were also deployed at once. The 1st Battalion, 22nd Infantry were, quote, dressed in olive drab service dress with strapped leggings and wearing campaign hats with light blue cords designating infantry, unquote. Troops were stationed to prevent looting, in addition to rescuing, feeding, sheltering, and clothing the survivors. Responses by Funston and the Army would be critiqued later for overly aggressive policies and military intervention. Hearings were held of suspected looting by soldiers, but nothing ever came of these. The city was sealed off to those without a military pass, but times were desperate and looting of the empty homes was rampant. Some shopkeepers, sensing the fires bearing down on their stores, invited the neighborhood in to loot it before the destruction came. Families grabbed what belongings they could before making their way to the ferries waiting to deliver them across the bay. The well-off got to skip the line. Most held out hope to the end that their home would be saved. Plates, silver, books, and other belongings too heavy to carry were often buried in the yard, and it was hoped that they would still be there when the family returned. If they did, in fact, return. That it struck in the morning may have been a lucky break. Many large downtown buildings were still empty, and people were spread throughout the city. San Francisco had rapidly become a center for finance and commerce on the West Coast, and a couple hours later would have seen the center of town filled with people hard at work. In the end, over 28,000 buildings were destroyed. The official death toll and the likely death toll differ by 10 times the amount. It's most likely close to 3,000 died in either the earthquake or fires. 250,000 were homeless. Many that left dispersed throughout the Bay Area or state and never came back. San Francisco was the most important wine city in the state, even though a grape was never grown there. Since 1860, wineries had their headquarters and shipping located in San Francisco. And now there are 28 wine companies in the city and over 15 million gallons of wine. The California Wine Association controlled about 75% of it, over 10 million gallons. In the late 1880s and early 1890s, the California wine industry was in a poor condition. It was well past the golden age of pomology that we discussed in episode 35, and large-scale plantings were happening all over the state, grapes included. Industrialization of the industry was in full swing. For a short time in the early 1880s, grape demand had far outstripped the supply, and vineyardists were charging as much as they could get away with. It seemed that export markets to Europe would be wide open forever as phylloxera started to ravage the vineyards of France. The pest spread its wings and moved rapidly vineyard to vineyard. New vineyards and wineries in California were popping up all over. Some were started by immigrants, yeah, but others by homesteaders or captains of industry. Everyone wanted to get in on the action, and this oversupply of grapes made prices plummet. Wine was being sold for less than what it cost to produce and rushed to market. These poor quality wines that were barely finished fermenting and made from vineyards leveraged to produce the most crop possible are what Professor Hilgard from the University of California was fighting against in his work. Isaac de Turk of Santa Rosa, one of the leading winemakers in the state, broke it down. Quote, "It is simply explained. Some of the merchants thought to make profitable speculation by buying up large quantities of cheap, raw wines and placing them in competitive sale with the superior product. At present, the outlook is anything but encouraging to the manufacturers. There is no market for our good wines, and those having cellars full of aged wines of first quality are unable to move their stock." Unquote. He also noted that vineyards were being destroyed by Pierce's disease in Anaheim. Phylloxera was starting to get a hold as well, especially in the Turk's region of Sonoma. Many grape growers didn't even drink wine, scared away because of alcohol and the impureness, perceived or otherwise. Some prominent winemen thought it best to dump much of the wine in the ocean, an opinion they shared in the newspapers and trade papers. More thought that distilling wine, especially the poor quality wines, or uprooting some vines was the answer. Still others felt the need for a man familiar with the wine business, who also happened to be a capitalist and could set them on the right path financially. Percy Morgan wasn't a wine man. He was born in London in 1862 to a well-off family, descended from some of the highest-born Welsh stock. After training with a classic British accounting firm, he was sent to America at the age of 19. The rush was on for gold, silver, and minerals as boomtowns popped up all over the West. He was first a bookkeeper at a Nevada mining company before moving on to Denver, Colorado, and Montana. His career progressed and evolved until he was helping to form and organize mining and early telephone companies. Escaping the inhospitable winters of Montana, he moved to San Francisco in 1886, quickly working his way into the business community. By 1892, he and his business partner William Hansen, another Englishman, were accountants and financial agents. Together, they were auditors for multiple telephone and telegraph companies, and they each sat on the board or served as vice president for alarm companies, fertilizer manufacturers, and fruit distributors. A mythical story passed down was that Hansen arrived in town with only $10 in his pocket. He found comfort in a budget hotel. Morgan, meanwhile, arrived with only $2, but put himself up at the Palace, the finest hotel in San Francisco. S. Lackman and Company, one of the larger wine firms in the city, would soon become a client of Morgan and Hansen. The Lackmans are going to appear a lot in our story, so the name is worth remembering. Samuel Lackman was born in Prussia in 1824 and came to California during the gold rush in 1850. At first, like many others, he mined in the El Dorado gold fields. Moving from the hard work of mining and, quote, cleaning up his sluice boxes, he opened a mercantile store in the northern foothills of Weaverville, selling an array of merchandise to the miners and settlers. This is a common theme of the gold rush, but those who sold supplies often fared much better than the miners themselves. With his partner, Adolf Eberhardt, a winemaker from Los Angeles, they established a San Francisco wine shop before expanding to 21st and R Streets in Sacramento. It was here they built a large brick winery. The company boomed, sending wines all over the U.S. They originally had a much more modest goal of producing wines for local consumption, but to meet demand, Lackman dumped all of his money into the operation to speed its expansion. By the mid-'70s, he had bought out Eberhard and renamed it S. Lackman Company. After the buyout, he would bring his sons Albert and Henry in to join him. They would have the largest winery in Sacramento for years, eventually holding over 2 million gallons. By 1888, the Lackmans made the jump to being solely wine merchants, selling their Sacramento winery and moving the business to San Francisco. Their new cellar would hold over 2.5 million gallons of wine and had an 80,000-gallon sherry tank, the largest in the world. Besides that sherry, they had other sweet wines like port, Tokay, Angelica, a sweet Catawba, and Madeira. Their dry wines were Muscat, Claret, Riesling, dry Catawba, and 2 types of Zinfandel, white and red. Samuel was apparently the first in California to use much larger oval casks for storage, but we don't know for sure how large they were. New York was their largest shipping market, and they would have offices there also. It was said, quote, no name can be more prominently mentioned in connection with the industry and its success than Samuel Lackman, unquote. William Randolph Hearst of the San Francisco Examiner had sent questions and surveys to many leading winemen, publishing them later in a series of articles in his paper. They opened under the title, Wine is Too Cheap, with questions like, what do you consider the cause of the present depression in the wine market? What remedy do you propose? Is there any general fault in California wine that prevents it from having a ready sale abroad? And many more. His interest may have been more than purely professional. His father had purchased what we now know as the Bedrock Vineyard, but at the time it was called Madrone. Dozens answered the survey, most with names that you might recognize, or will soon. De Turk, Strenzel, Noth, Julius Smith, R.C. Terry, Wenner, Schorb, even Professor Hilgard, and many more. The winemen's complaints were all the things we just mentioned: oversupply, poor quality wines, wine prices, startup capital to allow aging of wines, inexperienced winemen, taxes as always, and one more: the wine merchants. Oversupply was the first thing nearly all mentioned. Lack of capital was another big one. But the next reaction of many was summed up by Martin Denneke of Fresno. Quote, there is a combination among wholesale buyers and jobbers in San Francisco to lower the price of wine, and the wine growers can produce the evidence, I believe, unquote. Years earlier, Charles Wetmore of Cresta Blanca Winery and secretary of the State Viticultural Commission expressed much the same thing, foreseeing many of these issues. Quote, "The wine dealers have combined to cut down the prices of the vine products, and the vineyardists combined to offset their work. About 4 months ago, the circulars of the middlemen were sent abroad, saying that the California cellars were flooded with wine. This was done to influence the market." Unquote. Most winemakers believe the merchants were working together to keep wholesale prices depressed. As a would-be seller made his rounds, samples ready to taste, word of an offer would spread to the other merchants quicker than the winemaker could get to the next dealer. An overall economic depression that gripped the country compounded things. The solutions given on Hearst's surveys were to cap the amount produced, to distill the poorer quality wines into brandy, to tear out some of the newer vineyards, or to up raisin production. Total wine production was around 13 million gallons a year in the state. At about the time of the Hearst survey, dry wine production was roughly broken down as follows. The San Francisco firms made 2 million gallons in their country wineries. Independent wineries who marketed wine under their own names made about 1.5 million gallons. Producers who sold their wine to the San Francisco firms made about 7 million gallons. Morgan had his answer. Create a group of wine houses working together to stabilize wine prices and quality. I use the term wine houses, we'll also call them wine firms, because some were producers, some dealers, some owned their own production facilities and vineyards. Most were buying bulk wines from around the state and blending to fit their product lines and taste. The industry was steadily moving north to San Francisco after the dominance of Los Angeles and the surrounding area was shattered by Pierce's disease, aka the Anaheim disease. In 1860, San Francisco had 20 wine houses listed. In 1885, about 50. And then only 6 years later, there were well over 100. Rumors swirled in the newspapers and trade papers about the wine trust, as it was being called. Who was in, who was out, the secret dealings. Previous industry groups, some local and others statewide like the California Wine Growers Association, had been attempted and failed. Oftentimes they were banded together to fight taxes or tariffs. The Pre Prohibition wine industry almost always went back to taxes. The renowned California State Viticultural Commission was one such group that was fighting to promote California wines, improve the wines, and battle phylloxera. Morgan was the main moving force at the dawn of the CWA. Despite being a relative unknown to most winemen, he was a known commodity in the San Francisco business world. Hansen would be his lifelong business partner and friend, though often ceding the limelight to Morgan. Others like William Pfeffer, the pioneering Santa Clara grower, had their own answers. In June of 1893, when it seemed all but certain that there would be at least one combination forming, he wrote one of my favorite letters discussing the situation. Quote, "A combination of all wine producers can only insofar become feasible when we all have no more ambition than to produce the stuff asked for by one of the dealers some years ago with the words, 'To hell with your quality, I want quantity.' The ready compliance of the producers to furnish the quantity, and great quantities in many cases, is the very cause for all the trouble. Deny this who can." Unquote. In August of 1894, Morgan's plan came together. At last, the Wine Syndicate came to formation. The 7 wine houses that joined together were Kohler and Frohling, Kohler and Van Bergen, C. Carpy and Company, B. Dreyfus and Company, S. Lackman and Company, the Napa Valley Wine Company, and Arpad Harasti and Company. A capital stock of $10 million was subscribed, and the California Wine Association was started on the 10th of the month. There were 11 original investors, 10 men from the represented firms, plus Morgan. Later, shares would be distributed from the members to the firms they represented. All the wine house's assets, including wine, vineyards, buildings, and cash, were pooled together and proportional stock distributed equaling $2.6 million total. Most partners of the wineries would be subscribed at $300,000 to $400,000, and S. Lackman & Co. was subscribed at $500,000. These were some of the largest and most historical firms in San Francisco. The only thing that remained of their previous identity were trademarks to allow sales to continue in their markets. The New Orleans and New York markets were especially valuable. Charles Carpe was the first president and was elected by the member wineries. He had seemed to be in favor of forces being combined for a while, seeing how it could help them in foreign and East Coast markets, proposing for, quote, some leader to issue a call for winemakers, all winemakers in the state to combine wines, leading to higher prices for all, unquote. A full board of presidents, vice presidents, treasurers, secretaries, etc. were also elected. Morgan received a seat on the board as well as the title of general manager, running the auditing department and some advertising and other miscellaneous jobs. Hansen moved to New York to manage the East Coast business. The CWA announced their arrival with a promotional pamphlet stating, "It is our aim to increase in every way the rational and judicious consumption of wine in the United States and elsewhere by bringing to the market a light and wholesome wine at a price easily reached by the masses," unquote. Their goal was to get consistent quality wines into the homes of wine drinkers. The brand and label would be a mark of consistent quality. The logo and trademark of the CWA was to be a ship containing a depiction of Bacchus, the Greek wine god, aboard a small ship, oars out. A bear behind him as he holds up a glass of wine while the ship glides through the waters. The idea was presented in, quote, allegory. Young Bacchus hails across the sea, "Come all the world, come drink with me. There's wine o' fruit at the masthead trim, and puncheons fill the hold within. We're laden deep with joyous freight. 'Tis vintage of the golden state. The bear he leans on, standing near, is emblem grim of the pioneer. The barge glides out the golden gate. Its pilot mark the seal of state. Its winds refuse to lend their aid. The sturdy oarsmen ply the blade to spread abroad through every nation this trademark of the association." A little background about some of the other wineries that would make up the charter membership of the CWA. Many of the men who started these wine houses and whose names grace them were on their way out, retired, or dead by the time of the CWA. We already heard about S. Lackman, whose headquarters on Brannan would become the bustling main shipping depot for the CWA. That giant sherry tank alone could fill 27 train cars. These train cars would carry wines to Washington, D.C., Chicago, Memphis, Denver, and more. The wharves were just as conveniently located, and New Orleans, New York, Guatemala, and Seattle would receive deliveries via clipper ships, while the larger steamers would carry cargo onto Cuba, Puerto Rico, Japan, London, Germany, and the Philippines. Charles Carpe of C. Carpe & Co. was born in Bordeaux, and after arriving in Napa in his 20s, he worked his way up at various wholesalers and importers. The Van Bever and Thompson Winery in the city of Napa rounded out his wine business education. In 1885, he took over the Uncle Sam Winery in Napa, right along the river. By 1894, he purchased the Greystone Winery. This building is still one of the most recognizable in the Napa Valley. It served later as a longtime home to the Christian Brothers Winery, and currently the Culinary Institute of America, or CIA, resides there. The Greystone building could hold 1.3 million gallons of wine. Usually Carpe's highly rated Riesling and Cabernet were made here. Even in 1896, he was bragging about the Cabernet Sauvignon they were making at the Greystone Winery, and sometimes they were blending it with the other Medocs, Merlot, Cabernet Franc, Petit Verdot, and Malbec. Much of the million-plus gallons of wine he made were bulk level, but his La Loma Cabernet was said to be among the finest in the state, and the Vinecliff Riesling, a rare estate wine for the CWA, would be produced here as well. Like many others at the time, New Orleans was his main buyer for the bulk level wine. The location of the million-gallon-plus Uncle Sam Winery, right on the banks of the Napa River, made shipping by boat convenient. The winery filled all of a city block and then some. Small vessels and schooners could lie in wait at his wharf, protected from the river. Empty puncheons on board would be filled directly from tanks in the winery by men running a hose down the dock. A full load of wine was transferred in less than half the time this way, and with less men. Just before joining the CWA, it was estimated Carpe was holding over 1 million gallons in redwood tanks and another 200,000 plus in oak. The large Pacific winery in San Jose was also owned by Carpi and made more than both of his Napa wineries. When he purchased the winery and their 1888 vintage of 520,000 gallons in tanks at 10.5 cents a gallon, it was the largest wine purchase ever in the state. In the early 1890s, he was among the largest wine firms in the state. He had a small personal vineyard in Livermore with 7.5 acres of low-lying, western windswept vines on the gravelly loam soil so common there. He would get about 18 tons of Malbec, Zinfandel, Chasse Noir, and Meunier from the vineyard. Much more of his holdings were from purchased wine or grapes. An office on Sacramento Street in San Francisco and a small holding cellar on King Street completed his large wine firm. His friend, George Latour of the BV Winery, had partnered with Carpi in a cream of tartar enterprise as well. Carpi toured the country in 1890, analyzing the wine markets for himself. Upon his return, he's quoted as saying, "The outlook is very bright, and there is an active demand for good wine at good prices," unquote. Carpi would become the single largest shareholder in the CWA. Despite the unpretentious seller of the company, the 3 wineries of theirs we mentioned earlier were powerhouses in quality and quantity. His tasting ability was among the best in the CWA. The best, if you asked him. He retired from the wine business only a few years later to pursue other activities. Carpi's grandson was a partner when Freemark Abbey Winery started back up in 1967. Charles Kohler was called the father of the California commercial wine industry. He and another German musician, John Frohling, joined up famously, as the story goes, while walking to the Cliff House in San Francisco one day to eat. Frohling would move to LA to start the vineyards. Kohler would stay in SF to sell the wines. Together, they would help in the founding of the German wine colony of Anaheim, providing assurance that grapes grown would be purchased. They purchased large quantities of Los Angeles wine grapes also. Check out episode 48 with Matthew Keller for some more insight into their early operation in LA. By 1860, they had agents in New York and were routinely shipping wines to the East Coast from Los Angeles. Frohling would pass away in 1862, and a few years later, Kohler moved the center of production northward to the Central Valley and Glen Ellen in Sonoma County. Their Tokay vineyard there, run by his sons, was one of the most notable in the Sonoma Valley. It had been greatly expanded upon purchase and now had well over 200 acres of vines and a 250,000-gallon winery. So clean, quote, "A lady could walk through during crushing wearing a silk dress without fear of soiling it," unquote. Much of this would later become Jack London State Park. Kohler and Frohling were often called the pioneering dealers for their role in establishing San Francisco as a home for wine houses. Their building at 2nd and Folsom would become the CWA headquarters and primary blending cellar. It was likely the most majestic building in the CWA pre-earthquake, capable of holding 3 million gallons of wine. A granite portal led you into rich wooden-walled business and sampling offices. 18,000-gallon redwood tanks, along with an even larger blending tank and hundreds of smaller oak casks running from 25 to 3,500 gallons, filled the spacious cellar. It wasn't just the San Francisco office either. Their New York headquarters were a more or less downsized version, but with the same architectural touches like the granite portal entrance and 250,000 gallons of storage. Pre-CWA, they were the largest distributor in the state, their wines going as far as China, Japan, Peru, and Siberia. Even their auxiliary and overflow cellars were well known. One was in the basement of Los Angeles City Hall, and another in the Montgomery block of San Francisco. Perhaps none of the other CWA wineries would have a larger fall from grace. Charles Kohler's son, also named Charles, was a member of the company as well as the youngest board member. He helped oversee much of the winemaking. The building of the headquarters was also his doing. He passed away from a morphine overdose shortly after the formation of the CWA. Most nights he would take some morphine and whiskey to battle his insomnia. Many in the wine community thought it was a suicide, but Frank West, with whom he owned the Sierra Vista vineyard, flat out denied that Kohler would ever do such a thing. Arpad Hrasti was, of course, the son of the Count Augustin Hrasti, one of the wine industry's most influential early members and one of its largest personalities ever. Arpad was sent to Epernay in Champagne to study wine production by his father, eventually launching his Eclipse sparkling wine with Isidore Landsberger. Hrasti was known to bounce around between projects at times and left many failed partnerships in his wake, such as the massive Orleans Hill vineyard he purchased in Yolo County. It was originally owned by Jacob Nau, the nurseryman, and spanned 640 acres with 40,000 vines. By 1902, it was mostly sheep roaming the property, and not in a regenerative farming way either. His cellars were located in the Barbary Coast district of San Francisco, with multiple buildings spread across Washington, Jackson, Montgomery, and Sansom streets. Offices, cellars, cooperage shops, and shipping depots spread out along these blocks. The cooperage shop and main cellars connected via tunnel. His 1885 harvest would be the last commercial harvest crushed, fermented, and bottled in San Francisco proper for a long time. He only lasted until 1895 as part of the CWA, withdrawing from it in order to focus on his Eclipse champagne due to disputes with other CWA members about how this popular and high-quality wine would be best sold. He would continue to make wine but not sell it under his name and become one of the most important wine men in the state as president of the Viticultural Commission. His story's a much bigger one, and we'll get to it in time, but for the most part, we'll leave him here when discussing the CWA. Henry Kohler, no relation to Charles, and Edward Van Bergen had their own winery and brandy business in Sacramento. Both were said to be excellent tasters and businessmen. They built their winery in 1883 on land purchased from Leland Stanford at 31st and R in Sacramento, making solid wine. Originally, the winery was built to handle grapes from Stanford's Vina vineyards in Tahoma County and the Natoma Vineyard in Folsom, two of the largest in the state. They were around 5,000 acres when combined. Vina would send Trousseau, Zinfandel, Berger, and Charbonneau to the Sacramento winery. It was often used as an overflow facility for them. The CWA would make good use of the winery in the future. As Kohler and Van Bergen expanded, the Larkmead winery of Napa would come under their control for a few years in their quest to make a superior wine. While under CWA control, their up-to-date cellars at 3rd and Townsend Streets in SF would handle the stock for the city's jobbers, as well as overflow storage capacity for many of the other wines. Along with this 2 million-gallon cellar, the building would serve as some general office space. Both men were mature, conservative in their ways, and understated, and their wineries would be a dependable and highly valuable part of the CWA, even if not the most glamorous. Kohler would be the first superintendent of winemaking for the CWA. Benjamin Dreyfus immigrated to California from Bavaria. He would found the first general store in Anaheim, as well as building the first residence, both before there was an Anaheim. He would serve as its mayor in 1881 and 82, in addition to running his 800,000-gallon winery. It was conveniently located next to the Anaheim wine colony, and they built on the success of each other until Anaheim disease wiped out the vineyards of the area. His 240-acre vineyard and now 1 million-gallon winery were hit hard by the destruction. His large Rancho Cucamonga vineyard, owned in partnership with I.W. Hellman, stayed productive. Dreyfus, like most of the Southern California wine men, moved his operation north and opened a general store in San Francisco with his business partner Emanuel Goldstein. Perhaps their most lasting contribution is that together they planted Mount Pisgah Vineyard above the Sonoma Valley in 1886. 300 acres of mostly Zinfandel and Semillon, along with Riesling, Berger, and more were laid out on the red soils, making it one of the largest in the county. Phylloxera got to it nearly at once, and most of the vines were ripped out by the mid-90s, but soon replanted. After Dreyfus passed away, it was renamed the Goldstein Ranch. Today we call it Monte Rosso. A 3-story gravity-fed winery called Mount Peak was built the same year the vineyard was planted. Like the other partners, their warehouse was located in San Francisco. The firm's 1 million-gallon Eagle wine cellars was only 2 blocks from S. Lackman and would handle sweet wines and brandies for the CWA. Upon entering, 2,500-gallon casks lined the ground floor, except for one ornately carved 12,000-gallon cask. The giant eagle statue with spread wings on the otherwise plain brick building made it obvious to everyone where they were. Dreyfus and Goldstein had both passed away by the time the CWA started, but the firm remained in capable hands, staying a true powerhouse for the entirety of the association. Outside of Yountville lay the Vinecliff Vineyard, first planted in 1866. It expanded to over 120 acres when Colonel John D. Fry purchased it. Fry would also be a founder and vice president of the Napa Valley Wine Company when it was incorporated in 1883. The Vinecliff Claret he produced would become a flagship wine of the CWA. It was a Cabernet and Merlot blend from the terraced and south-facing vineyard and aged in both oak and redwood cooperage. The Napa Valley Wine Company was started as a way for its wine growers to get direct access to their customers. Frustration had mounted that their quality wines were being lost in anonymous blends when they sold to other firms. Board members of the company owned over 1,000 acres in the Napa Valley. Some big names. Alfred Tubbs was president. Other members included William Lyman in St. Helena, James Goodman, a Napa banker, William Esty of Atlas Peak, J.B. Atkinson of Rutherford, as well as William Scheffler, and rounding it out, Charles Krug, one of the true pioneer wine growers in Napa. Their main winery was located just across the Napa River from the Uncle Sam winery of Charles Carpy. After the CWA was incorporated, a pipe was run across the river connecting the two wineries. Despite their heavy Napa presence, like most others, their offices were in San Francisco. The main office was located on First Street and the 500,000-gallon cellar on King Street. An associate of theirs, E.C. Pryber, would help them expand their Midwest presence after working with the Gunlock family and then the Anaheim growers. He would later become the firm's general manager and serve as the Napa representative for the State Viticultural Commission. Although they started out as perhaps the highest quality top-to-bottom firm in the CWA, after Tubbs passed away and Pryber withdrew, their small size came back to haunt them as their influence in the CWA diminished. In turning over all their assets except trademarks and labels, the firms agreed to have evaluations done. One group would establish the true value of physical assets, and another would grade and assess the wines. It was expected that some other wine houses would join once they saw the newly formed company, but all instead held out. The following spring, Arpad Hrasti & Co. quit the CWA for the reasons we stated earlier. This was an era of trusts, concerns, machines, syndicates, associations, etc. All words that make us think of monopolies, not just in wine, but oil, steel, sugar, tobacco, railroads, and more. The CWA controlled their process all the way from the vineyards to the consumer. As soon as they incorporated, they controlled around 50% of the wine in the state and would control much more as time went on. Despite controlling so much, they never ran afoul of antitrust legislation. It might have been because they were keeping prices lower and not gouging the consumer, or because they allowed the illusion that the wineries and firms were independent to continue, even at times competing against each other in markets. Most of the wine houses kept their leadership in place, and the changes were all beneath the surface. The Sherman Antitrust Act tended to focus more on staples that everyone needed and not luxury or discretionary products like wine. Newspapers even wrote about it. Quote, "Organizations of this kind are of a worthy character and not open to objection. They do not aim to command extortionate prices or to establish a monopoly, but simply to protect producers from the ruinous cutting of prices that prevails where there is no organization to fix and establish a fair schedule of rates." Unquote. C. Schilling and Company, Lachman and Jacobi, the Italian-Swiss agricultural colony, and J. Gunlock and Company were four of the large firms that held out and didn't join the CWA. C. Schilling looked to be a shoo-in all the way to the end, but would ultimately back out. Like we said earlier, the Kohler and Froehling building, built in 1890 at Folsom and 2nd Street, would be the first headquarters of the California Wine Association. It was called a, quote, magnificent structure. It also consisted of 3 stories plus a basement and was finished with brick, granite, and terracotta. The great granite portal entrance was located right on the corner. The building ran another 275 feet up 2nd Street and 137 feet down Folsom. The wood-paneled offices were the most up-to-date, with plenty of space for guests to relax or taste samples of the various wines in the cellars of the CWA. Fireproof brick and iron doors separated the wine storage area from these offices. The main wine vault floor held hundreds of casks and barrels, 3,500-gallon barrels down to half barrels. A quick trip down to the basement would show you the 4 18,000-gallon blending tanks. Steam pumps connected everything for ease of use and quickness. These large tanks helped the firm to keep certain blends consistent over time while also creating new ones as needed. Another large tank was built into the floor of the basement with pumps running to and from it. The second and third floors were used only for storing finished wines. A 75 by 137-foot section cut off from the main building was used for sherry on one level. On another level, it contained the engine room with a 55-horsepower engine and 2 55-horsepower boilers that they would alternate using each month so as to keep them working smoothly. Heat from furnace fires could also be piped through these boilers to save on fuel costs. And there was, of course, a coal depot capable of holding 200 tons of coal. A deep well was dug for furnishing all the water needed, and a hydraulic elevator made moving barrels and casks easy. 3 million gallons of wine could be stored here when fully stocked. This made it the largest wine cellar in the Americas. One of those holdout wine firms, the Italian-Swiss agricultural colony, would move into the old Kohler and Frohling building. The first year the CWA purchased grapes for $8 a ton and up. They called attention to the fact that, although they would prefer to have struck a deal with producers and growers before harvest started, the August date of incorporation made that impossible. But they vowed to work on this for the next year. Thanks for listening today. This is part 1 of the series. Next time we'll hear about what happens when the CWA has competition in the wine market, how they react and how others react to it. It's the wine wars. You can follow the podcast on wherever you're listening and the Instagram at IndieWinePodcast, and feel free to email indiewinepodcast@gmail.com with comments, questions, or feedback. If you can tell your wine friends about the podcast too and help spread the word, I'd really appreciate it. Rating or subscribing helps too. There's also a Patreon if you choose to support the podcast monetarily to allow for more episodes and to help defray other costs like travel, research book purchases, things like that. Any amount is appreciated. I have a small token of my appreciation to send you also if you do. The link is in the show notes. We'll be back soon with part 2. Have a good one.